All right, this is Sanctity of Human Life Month, and we've done several videos already looking at the sanctity of human life. And today I'm sitting down with Jessica Stevens, and Jessica's a member of our congregation. Jessica's a believer. Jessica also works in social care here in Stanley County and works specifically with foster care. And so I want to ask Jessica a few questions on how foster care ties into the sanctity of human life and how it can be a response to the sanctity of human life. So our first question, Jessica, is simply what role does foster care play in caring for orphans?
So to that, I would say that if we did not have people that signed up to be foster parents, then the children that we care for in the custody of the state would be orphaned. So they're kind of stepping in as that in between to prevent them from actually getting to the orphaned state.
Right. When you read English literature and you study history a couple hundred years ago, I think about Charles Dickens and some of his stuff he wrote. You see the orphan in London living on the street, begging for scraps. And of course, we know now that that's a primary condition for trafficking and all other sorts of issues, right? We don't see that. I'm not saying it doesn't exist in America, but I'm saying we don't see that in the public very often. But we would if foster care wasn't that in between.
Right.
And that's the state doing that, right? It's not, the church typically isn't doing foster care. It's the state that is governing and maintaining the foster care system. And so you're right. So if we didn't have that, these kids would be orphans. They would be orphans if it were not for the state. So why should, if it's the state doing it, why should Christians get involved in foster care?
Well, I think I'm going to first refer to a verse here in James 1:27. It says, "Pure and undefiled religion before God the Father is this, to look after orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." So I think right there, simply God's calling us to do it. He's calling people to care for these children, though we're talking about children that aren't per se orphaned at this point, but without these people they could be. I think other reasons, and it's scriptural, it's in here, he calls us to be like him. He calls us to show love and kindness and grace and mercy. What better way than to reach out and step in for these kids, and not just the kids, their families too.
When I think about Matthew 25, I think Jesus says, "As much as you've done it to the least of these, my brothers, you've done it unto me." Kids that are neglected, are abused, are mistreated, whatever the case may be, that's the least of these, my brothers, right?
Yes,
I mean, Jesus says, "Do it unto them, you've done it unto me." And you bring out the verse in James. One of the things I like to think about and point out is when James wrote in the first century, the culture, there was no welfare state, there was no state government foster care system, and so God is using James and using the other apostles to tell the early church and to say, okay, somebody has to take care of these kids, right? The state's not doing it. Rome certainly wasn't doing it. So who's going to do that? It's the church. It's the followers of Christ, being like Christ, that's going to step in and do that. So, okay, so let's talk more practically for just a few moments. How can Christians get involved in foster care? So we've established why they should, but how can they do that?
So the first step would be calling the agency. In Stanley County, if you live here, you would call Stanley County DSS. If you live in another county, you would call that county agency. And so I work for the public sector. There's private agencies as well that do foster care. So there's lots of avenues. I tell people the first step is just doing your research to figure out which direction you want to go and call in and talk to somebody. If you know of a foster family, talk to them. They're your best resource, truly, to kind of give you the nitty gritty of what goes into it.
Yeah, you mentioned the private sector. One of the Baptist Children's Home does that, which, as Southern Baptist and as specifically as that's a North Carolina Baptist entity. Right. So as a church, we're already supporting that financially, the Baptist Children's Home, and that is a private option to avenue.
Absolutely,
yes, and agency for foster care.
They have group homes and they have regular licensed foster homes, and we've actually had children from Stanley County placed in their facility.
Right. So. So yeah, contacting the agency, which probably is going to, if it's in Stanley County, is going to point them back to a conversation with you.
Correct.
Right. So that you can call the agency. Call me. You're gonna end up talking to Jessica at some point.
I'll give you my number.
Right. So and you're right. I think it's really good advice to talk to foster families. My family and we've done foster care for several years and several kids in and out of our home. And we've sat down at the dinner table with numerous couples and had that, here's what it's really like conversation. You can watch movies and you can read stories, but most of the times those are just stories. Right. It's not real life. And so, because it is very difficult. Foster care is probably one of the most challenging things we've ever been involved in or accomplished. So let's talk about some of the objections to doing foster care. One of the things that I hear often is I'm too old. I hear folks tell me, especially in the church, will tell me, if I had thought about that in my younger years, but the reality is in your younger years, and this is what young families will say, well, I'm too busy.
Right.
I've got kids of my own. I've got ball practices, and we both work, and I can't do it. So, but then when you get to that point of retirement. And you have empty beds in your home, empty bedrooms in your home. You have no commitment. You don't have work. You don't have any of that. Then you're just, well, now I'm just too old. Right. So what do you tell foster people in those cases?
I typically I'm just very straightforward that you can come up with every excuse in the book not to do it.
Exactly.
I will talk to families time after time for 3 to 4 years before they may even just take the plunge. And those are the families that keep calling back or that I have that nagging feeling when I first talk to them that I constantly send them something. And I would say the overwhelming majority end up getting licensed. But you can come up with anything to say, hey, I shouldn't do this. But again, I think it does point back to us that are believers. Christ is calling you. If he's continuing to kind of nag at it in your heart, he's calling you to do that. And it may not be that you take these kids in your home, and we may get into that, but it may be that you support the program in another way. So there's so many ways that you could support it without being a technical foster parent, having kids, rotate in and out of your home. But whether it's you say you're too old or you say that you're going to get too attached and you can't give them back, you can.
So you're bringing out a couple of things I want to point out. So you keep talking about the calling. We're called to do that as Christians. That is significant in deciding to do it, because if the reason that I'm not doing it is it's not a convenient time in my life, or I'm not physically I'm too old or too busy or whatever. It's a calling from God. God didn't say I'm going to make everything easy for you.
Right.
I mean, if it was easy, anybody could do it. But God's called you to do it. He's called us as believers to do it. And so we have to take that step and say, okay, God, this isn't the best time in my calendar or my schedule in my life. But if this is what you're calling me to do, I'm going to trust you and I'm going to walk through that door and I'm going to do it. And that's just, we got to see the calling on our lives as Christians. And you talked about getting attached. That's the second objection that I hear often is I could never do that because I couldn't give them back, after a certain period of time. What do you say to that?
You're going to get attached.
What if I told you I want to do foster care because I know I won't get attached?
And this is definitely not for you. And because I need you to go all in.
Right.
These kids, their families, they need you to go all in. So you guys have had kids stay in your home permanently, but you've also had to say goodbye.
Yeah.
That hurt.
Yeah.
I'm sure you got upset, you cried, you grieved. You're going to. It's natural. We have to take ourselves out of this whole thing and think about the calling is for the kids. And so with that, I had a couple of points that I always kind of like to bring out when you're thinking about it. Like I said, take yourself out of it. This is about the child. So if you say I'm too old or I can't do it because I'm going to get attached, but think about what you can do and bring to that child's life. And I keep referring to the parents too, because what we're doing, not me, what we're doing as in social services in the foster care system is we're putting families back together. And so you have an important role in that as well with these families. So you have to think about what you and your family can give to this child and their family. So you got to think about that child who's lost so much. They could experience the growth of love through what you're able to provide for them. They could gain that. And if you never did that, just think what they're missing now. And another thing, I always like to tell people, it's not about getting that child for your family. It's about giving of your family for that child. And then his name's Jason Johnson. He's a blogger. I think he's actually a Christian blogger. Several years ago, I found something that he wrote, and I loved this quote, and I share it with people, especially just thinking about the fear that comes along with it, because it's unknown, and as you said, it's tough, it's hard. It is. It's one of the hardest journeys that you will ever be on. Just like parenting, if you're a parent and you have you go on that journey, because you don't know where it's going to lead. But you can't let the fear. This is what Jason Johnson says. You can't let the fear of loving a child who might leave deter you. You must let the fear of a child never knowing love drive you. So I just always like to point people back to that. Don't let your fears step in. Try to think about what that child's going through and what you could offer to them.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the last kids that we had in our home in foster care, we brought in as an infant. I want to say he was 5 or 6 days old. Brought him home from the hospital, NICU, all that kind of stuff. Raised him for 6 months. You spend the first 6 months of this child's life caring for him, watching him become healthy and grow and put on weight and all of these things, and then went to another a kinship placement family member, and that was almost a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. My kids still ask about him. Like on a regular basis, still ask about him, still pray for him. And his name comes up so often. And we got a picture, even this week, we got a picture. He's being adopted by this kinship person. And it was such a joy that, and he looks so different now. And it's like, wow, we had no idea what he was going to look like, but my goodness, look at that hair and things like that. And so, it is hard, and there are tears, but there's also joy in that too. One of the things that you mentioned a moment ago that I think oftentimes families people don't necessarily understand or think about. I didn't know this when I got into foster care, was that the goal of foster care is actually reunification with the biological natural family unit. Yes. I had no idea. I thought everybody giving up on these kids and now we're stepping in and being the heroes. Right. Well, God put that child with this family naturally. Like that was God's design. Correct. And you're stepping in and saying, hey, we're trying to help fix this to where this is a safe environment for this child to be raised in the way God intended by his biological mother and father, if at all possible. And of course, the success rate there may not be the highest. A lot of times these kids end up being adopted. But from time to time, there's a family that does it, and they get their children back, and that is a huge success story. And there's joy in seeing that. Yes. And so in foster care, one of the things that we learned was the term co-parenting, which again, new to me, and I was imagine new to many of our folks that are watching. But co-parenting, I have to learn how to parent this child while this child's in my home, but at the same time, visiting, in communication with biological parents.
Mm-hmm.
I'm helping them parent. It's there, and that was one of the harder parts of it. I mean, that is very difficult. I mean, typically are different values and different beliefs and different priorities, and so anyhow, there's so much to that. Jessica, one of the things before we conclude that I want to think about is the way that the church can get involved with foster care.